The clone spell is without a doubt the worst spell ever created in Clash Royale. On paper, it might seem like a clever way to double your troops, but in reality, it is a disaster waiting to happen. Fragile, unreliable, and often more trouble than it's worth. For just 3 elixir, you'd expect decent value, but more often than not, it leaves you regretting your decision. Throughout Clash Royale's history, the clone spell has been consistently overlooked and ridiculed, ranking among the least used spells in the game. But believe it or not, there were brief moments when the clone spell actually dominated the meta. Some days when it was an absolute beast. Today we're diving into the clone's messy history, how it went from a hyped new addition to a card most players avoid, and why it's earned the title of the worst spell. This is the sad history of the clone spell. Did you know that before the clone spell was officially released, it was leaked? Yeah, somehow it got out, and a few images started circulating within the community. The first image showed 3 lumberjacks together in one place, which is impossible to achieve in normal gameplay. The second image featured 2 bombs about to explode on the tower, but with a notable difference. The second bomb was blue instead of the usual color. In the third image, it became clear what the developers had been up to. There were a lot of musketeers. After these leaks, the clone spell was officially announced along with 3 different cards: Tornado, Electro Wizard, and of course, Elite Barbarians, because it was 2016. Before the clone spell was available to everyone, Supercell liked to host card challenges, allowing players to battle for early access to new cards. The Clone Challenge was no exception and was soon announced. As you can imagine, everyone was curious about the potential of the clone spell and which combos would work best, but we'll get to that in a moment. Before we do dive in though, why not take a moment and click that big red subscribe button? It's free, after all. You can also join my Discord server and consider becoming a YouTube member for some cool perks and other benefits. Thank you, and let's get back to cloning. So after the Clone Spell Challenge ended, the spell was released for everyone on December 9th, 2016 in the Frozen Peak Arena. Plus, you could purchase 10 cards from the shop for 400 gems, which was a bit pricey at the time, but for a new card with so much potential, it was worth it. The clone spell was unlike any other spell or card available at that time. While many expected it to function similarly to the mirror card, it turned out to be much different than expected. For starters, the spell effectively clones all troops within its radius. The clone troops mirror the original ones in every aspect, from stats to abilities. However, they all have only 1 hit point, making them extremely vulnerable. This vulnerability means that spells like Log, Zap, and Arrows could easily counter cloned pushes. Ice Golem 2 was a very powerful counter to the cloned pushes because its Death Nova would wipe all the clones out. Fortunately, this isn't usually a significant issue, as most cloned pushes involve skeleton cards, which were already vulnerable to a single arrow shot. Champions can also be cloned, retaining their stats and mechanics but not their abilities. If a champion's ability is activated, it would only affect the original, not the clone, which honestly is for the best, though we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The clone spell would not stack, therefore you couldn't clone the original troop and its clone together. Only the original troop. If you wanted to play a very gimmicky deck, you could mirror your troop and then clone it to get 4 troops in total. The mirror clone combo was pretty insane. Interestingly, when the cloning mechanic was first introduced, it had a distinctive behavior. The clone always pushed the original troop to the left, resembling how a cell divides in 2. This meant that the original troop would be targeted first by the enemy's princess tower. This tactic, often referred to as clone skipping, allowed troops to evade enemy buildings effectively. For example, if you deployed a balloon and the enemy placed a building in response, you could clone your balloon. The balloon would be pushed left, moving it out of the building's range and allowing it to continue targeting the enemy princess tower. Pretty neat. There was one more downside to the clone card. It briefly suspended the unit during the cloning process. This meant that while your troop was being cloned, the original would stop for a moment before resuming its attacks, and as a result, this interruption could cancel attacks and charges, which was frustrating. Once the clone ended, the original troop wouldn't retarget the princess tower. Instead, it would focus on enemy troops or buildings that were closer within its range. And I think this downside was reasonable if we compare the big potential it carried, so it was balanced out. The card, I mean. What wasn't balanced were the combos players came up with and destroyed opponents with. In theory, bait decks would work the best for Clone, since it was and still is vulnerable to spells, but surprisingly that wasn't the case. While it had many opportunities of being used as a strategic card, it did the opposite. One of the cards that worked best with Clone was the Giant Skeleton. Yeah, Giant Skeleton. It was a cheeky spawner deck because of the Giant Skeleton's Death Bomb, which, remind you, deals massive damage, and the Clone, which retains every card mechanic, duplicated that bomb. So if a bomb deals massive damage, how much damage would 2 bombs deal? That's right, even more massive damage. It wasn't perfect every time though, because things weren't always in your favor. For instance, the Giant Skeleton often struggled to reach the Princess Tower. However, this created another opportunity for Clone to shine. If the enemy was unaware that you had the Clone spell and sent troops to counterattack, deploying a well-timed Clone could result in 2 unexpected bombs hitting the enemy, completely dismantling their counter. Another card that was even deadlier, if not equally so, was the Lava Hound, particularly in the Lava Clone deck. This combination could completely dominate enemy towers and had the potential for a 3-crown victory nearly every time, especially if the opponent wasn't paying attention. The main factor for the deck to succeed was always timing. You had to time your Clone right for your Lava Hound so the Princess Tower and the enemy troops would target the original Lava Hound instead of its clone. After it'd die, it would spawn the lava pups, but before these pups spawned, the Princess Tower also managed to kill the cloned Lava Hound, resulting in a lava pup army, and situations like this. The deck also made great use with the Elite Barbarians, which weren't a card to joke around with at that time. You can already imagine how many arenas looked like with this deck. Even though the card was carrying a lot of potential and power, its usage rate for 2016 was mostly 0% in competitive play. It had cool mechanics, but the downsides it had were just not suitable for competitive play. Time, even milliseconds, matter in Clash Royale, especially in the top ladder. It's a different story in the mid ladder though. While we don't have an exact estimate for usage rates at this level, I believe it probably hovers around 10 to 15%. The usage rate began to rise significantly in 2017, particularly after March 13th, when Supercell adjusted the clone spell so that it no longer reset the charge attacks of original troops. While the original troops would still charge, the clones would spawn without being charged, maintaining their behavior prior to this change. This adjustment allowed the clone spell to work effectively with charging cards like the Prince and Dark Prince, for example. And as for decks, the Giant Skeleton clone and Lava clone were also getting better and better. This is also when players added a new card to the Giant Skeleton clone combo, the Skeleton Barrel, which fit insanely well and made the troll deck even more troll. You'd see many decks containing these 3 cards with many others to create the best ones. The Skeleton Barrel also fit insanely well with the Lava Hound, making the Swarm deck even deadlier than before. Once again, this is when we saw the unexpected clone taking place, surprising and overwhelming the enemy more and more. While mentioning these decks, I kinda forgot to mention the Balloon, and it was basically used the same as the Giant Skeleton, if not better. The double death damage plus the double connection completely obliterated the enemy tower out of the arena. These decks were only getting stronger and stronger, and due to the increasing popularity of them from casual matches, and add in the icing on the cake, on June 12th, Supercell decreased the cloning time to 0.5 seconds from 0.8, which might not seem like a big difference, but oh man, trust me, it was huge. This 0.3 second change basically made the cloned Giant Skeleton and Balloon even more deadly and quicker. The popularity rose to about 20 to 25% in mid-ladder, and even scratched the usage rate surface in top ladder with 6% usage by September, which was a massive improvement. Also, a little bit of a trivia question for you. When was the Night Witch released? If you said 2017, then you're right. If you also remember, back then it was very strong due to her bat spawning ability. So now listen, if the Swarm clones worked incredibly well, like Lava Hound pups for example, why wouldn't it work with the Night Witch, especially with the 4 bats she spawned on her death? That's exactly what players started experimenting with, and it did not lead to disappointment. To make things even worse for the enemy, Mirror was also added to cycle and mirror as many Night Witches as possible, and it all worked surprisingly well. The Night Witch was literally broken by the clone spell. While it can be fun to play with broken decks, having death bats on the Night Witch added another layer of excitement. As you may recall, clone was the reason Supercell eventually nerfed her bats. This nerf wasn't limited to the Night Witch. Elite Barbarians also faced adjustments, and the changes didn't stop there. In mid-ladder, the clone spell had a solid 30% usage rate, possibly even 35%. However, at the top ladder, its usage plummeted to either 1% or 0. The reason for this disparity is that the decks we mentioned earlier were primarily used by trolls looking to have fun. They were the kind of gimmicky, thoughtless decks where winning required minimal strategy, making them more suited for casual play rather than competitive. For the remainder of 2017 and much of 2018, the clone spell maintained a 1 to 2% usage rate in the top 100, accompanied by a win rate of around 20%. However, significant changes were on the horizon. In June of 2018, Supercell increased the clone spell's radius from 3 to 4 tiles, allowing players to clone even more troops within its range. Prior to this adjustment, clone was primarily used in troll decks featuring the giant skeleton and the skeleton barrel, but this was about to change, as it began to find its way into a wider variety of deck archetypes. 2018 marked the year the clone spell became a favorite within the Clash Royale community, particularly in Golem decks. While the Night Witch dominated arenas alongside the Golem, the clone spell integrated seamlessly into this powerful duo. There was even a deck that utilized the Mirror card, and here I'm referring to the Mirror Golem clone deck. Just hearing the name sounds pretty intimidating. Although the deck averaged 4.3 elixir, it could obliterate anything in its path once double and triple elixir times arrived. The Golem was the type of card that screamed "go all in" after countering an opponent's attack. With the combination of Mirror and Clone, it became more aggressive than ever, and the aggression did not stop there. Why settle for one witch when you could have two? The Goblin Double Witch Clone deck proved to be so powerful that it consistently won grand challenges with minimal losses, often securing 3-crown victories. This was a testament to the deck's strength and the reason it became part of the emerging meta. Lava Hound and Balloon also united into one deck, synergizing extremely well with the other cards in the same deck. By the end of 2018, the usage rate of the clone spell in the top ladder was still at 1%, but in casual, don't even bother asking. 2019 came with some big news to the clone spell. It was going to get a rework in February, and oh boy, the clone was never going to be the same as it once was, because the rework made the card even more deadly with the gimmick decks. First, let's cover what they reworked before we get on to what decks it was used in. So remember how the cloning process always would push the original troop to the left, causing clone skipping? Well, while the clone skipping mechanic was really useful in many places, it also made the clone just, I don't know, useless, because the cloned troop would get sniped from the second princess tower from far away, resulting in the clone value to drop. Now, Supercell decided to change this mechanic and rework it, which made the cloned troops spawn behind the original troops while also pushing them forward. This little change made connecting to the towers more possible, and if back then Giant Skeleton always struggled to get his bag of bones to the tower to do death damage, well now the clone's push made it so it had a better chance. Plus, if the giant skeleton is near your opponent's tower and you're a single tile away for your death bomb to do damage, the clone push gets you that much closer for that bomb to explode on the tower. But don't worry, if you like the previous clone skipping mechanic, it's still possible today. It's just harder to pull off. Now let's talk about the decks, and damn, you are in for a treat. First and foremost, the Lava Hound clone got even stronger, now being able to win matches by 3 crowns. This rework caused a massive shift in usage rates. For mid-ladder, the usage rate was probably 35%, while in April, it managed to reach 4% usage in top ladder with a win rate of 41%. Even though in April they decreased the clone's radius to 3 tiles from 4, the usage rate was still pretty high. In July, interestingly, they removed the clone from draft selections, which is understandable, sort of, but hey, you do you, Supercell. This was basically it for 2019. It's all in 2020 that it gets interesting. With the decks, all the previous gimmicky decks we mentioned since day one were still a force to be reckoned with. Golem Clone was popular again and again with the power to 3 crown in just under a minute. Wow. Under a damn minute. Now let's get to the fun stuff. Did you know that the clone was bugged? Like, really bugged. Yeah, this was possible. So one of the minor bugs that happened this year was the ability to make the giants cross rivers with the help of the ice golem and, of course, the clone spell. For this to work, you had to quickly put down both the ice golem and the giant and instantly clone. After a bit of experimentation, the person who found the bug confirmed that it was also possible with other cards such as the battle ram, elixir golem, knight, magic archer, princess, cannon card, etc. And it was patched very soon, despite the fact that it was a very minor bug compared to the one I'm going to talk about now. And the clone bug here was more of a combination of also heal and, to be specific, the heal spirit. Ever since release, the clones were always at 1 hit point, and there was nothing the player could do to increase their health. But because this bug existed, it was possible to increase the health of the cloned troops now with the clone and the heal spirit, making the bugged clone tank more damage than intended.
Right here, I have clone in rotation. We're gonna play in half speed. Heal spirit jumps. I use the clone right as he's getting healed in the moment. Everything looks normal, right? Looks like a regular clone. Clones usually have 1 health and they die in 1 health. But no, it tanked 2 princess tower shots.
You can just imagine an opponent's confused face as they think about how our clone managed to survive 2 or 3 arrow shots when it was supposed to die in 1. This led to many wins that were just never meant to be possible. Fortunately, Supercell fixed this bug at the end of August, so bye-bye bugged clones. The next year though, in 2021, is where the clone gets a little more interesting. The pre-existing decks were becoming more meta by the day, and were becoming even deadlier. For instance, the cannon cart started appearing in almost every deck Giant Skeleton and Clone were in, and it was a very versatile card that synergized extremely well with the Clone and Giant Skeleton because of its shield mechanic. As you know, the cannon cart moves around and shoots, but when its health gets depleted, it breaks down, stays in one place, and becomes a regular cannon. And cloning it just worked and dealt massive damage along with the Giant Skeleton. Mirror also started getting included in every deck Clone was in. Another heavy but tanky deck would soon be created called the Golem Giant Skeleton Clone. It had the same synergy as the Golem Clone, but now with extra bomb spawners, the Giant Skeleton. To make it even crazier, it had 2 witches yet again, the Night Witch and the Mother Witch. Oh, and if you're wondering about the champions, they can be cloned, but their special abilities aren't clonable, so you just end up with another champion with 1 HP without their ability. And that's the reason why cloning champions wasn't that big of a game breaker, which was a good thing. These decks would soon find their places inside the meta for the rest of 2021. But there's one thing we can't forget for this year, and it is another silly bug. A bug was discovered for spawner cards, so that'd be cards like Lava Hound and Golem, for example, and what this bug basically did was, when they were clones, the Lava Pups and the Golemites would spawn at full health instead of just 1 HP, which is a massive deal, as you can imagine. It's pretty devastating. Players who faced against this deck were left confused as to why the clone misbehaved like that. It was soon patched in November, so thank God that wasn't a thing anymore. As for usage rates in the top ladder, it had a 1% usage rate in January. In October, it went up to 7% because of these strong synergies, and probably because of that bug, but in December, it went back down to 2%. In mid-ladder, it was just more, as you could probably assume. 2022 was the same for usage rates, well, pretty much, but while at a consistent 1 to 2% usage, its win rate was around 50%. New decks had been cooked up, for example, the most deadly one being the Goblin Barrel Mirrored Clone, which was extremely powerful, and 2v2 players used this deck a lot to 3-crown the enemy just by Goblin cloning the King Towers alone. But this was not game-breaking, because mostly the push was stopped with arrows or zap. If not, it was just game over. Minion Horde Clone also popped up, which was fragile, but when it worked, it worked. Other decks that became meta at this time included these cards: Giant Skeleton, Skeleton Barrel, Mirror Clone, and the Cannon Cart. Imagine how a single card could synergize so well with so many, creating the most gimmicky and cheating deck ever seen in Clash Royale. In 2023, Clash Royale was in a pretty crazy state. Card evolutions were new and everyone's favorite, and they were also, pretty freaking broken. The Little Prince was introduced, and you already know how big of a fan favorite he was. For the decks, Golem decks were still very popular. Some people even made it cycle with just 2.1 elixir, and that's pretty huge. The deck managed to get some decent wins, which meant that the clone meta was not dead yet. Archer Queen also found her place inside the giant skeleton clone meta by providing some great defense and counter-offensive capabilities. Evolved cards also worked well with clone. Also, in 2023, the game was notorious for its bizarre and often humorous bugs related to cloning. For instance, one bug caused cloned troops to moonwalk instead of properly executing their cloning function. The cloned version of a troop would push the original forward and it wouldn't stop sliding until it reached the enemy tower, where it would then deal damage. Another bug involved the Goblin Giant and the Ram Rider. It's a bit tricky to explain, but essentially the clone spell struggled to handle units that were positioned on top of other troops. So let's start with the Goblin Giant. You know how it's two spear goblins that ride on its back? Upon the Goblin Giant's death, these spear goblins were supposed to drop down and continue attacking. However, instead of dropping, they inexplicably spawn on the map out of thin air. The clone spell successfully cloned the Goblin Giant, but it also caused the spear goblins on its back to double spawn as disembodied heads, creating the illusion of floating heads on the ground. These bugged clone spear goblins attack as normal, and once they were killed, regular clone spear goblins would appear. Remember, you also had the other two Goblin Giants with their spear goblins in play. It was like having the Goblin Gang, but more powerful. The Ram Rider experienced a similar glitch. After being cloned, she spawned her usual clone, but also a version of herself without her ram, leaving her unable to move. However, she still retained her snare mechanics. The reason behind this bug seems to be that the Ram Rider and her ram are two separate models stacked on top of one another. A closer look at the in-game troop confirms this. The ram is exclusive to the Ram Rider and doesn't function as an independent troop, which explains why the clone only replicated the Ram Rider without her ram. It's an intriguing bug, raising questions about how such an issue arose seemingly out of nowhere. These are mysteries that may never be fully explained. Another very crazy bug was with the Little Prince. We already talked about it in the Little Prince's history video, which, I mean, if you haven't watched it already, you'll probably love it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it here again. Basically, if the clone was timed perfectly whenever you activated the Little Prince's Guardian ability, you would spawn not the cloned, but two full health Guardians. The Little Prince and his Guardian at that time were very broken too stat-wise, so this bug was massive, which led to many unwanted encounters and 3 crowns. Fortunately, these bugs were fixed on a minor update of November 13th, and goddamn, that's a lot of bugs for one card for 1 year. Okay. Usage rates were the same like other years, consistent 0 to 1% in the top ladder, but because of the strong decks and bugs in casual play, the usage rate was pretty high before coming back down. The win rates, though, were still relatively great, with around 40 to sometimes even 55% win rate, which is impressive. The same can be said for 2024, where today it sits at a 1% usage rate with a 40% win rate. Nothing's changed with the clone card ever since 2023 as of making this video. And the clone may not be in its hottest state right now, but that's why the communities exist, to come up with concept ideas and introduce others to it. So let's look at some clone concept ideas. So what if we made this spell into a troop? How about we make it like the wizard, introducing the cloning mage who deals damage while also having the ability to duplicate himself on the battlefield. So basically, he's like a wizard who just shoots blue orbs while also having the ability to duplicate himself and not need the clone spell. Honestly, not a bad idea. I mean, we got the Ice Wizard, Fire, Electric, why not a clone and heal as well? Plus, we've already seen this mechanic used for the Evo Skellies. Might be interesting to see it on a ranged troop. Another troop idea is the Clone Witch, who's able to create clones of nearby friendly troops just by looking at them. That sounds like a creative idea. She's like Medusa, but instead of turning people into stone, she clones them. Pretty neat. The just by looking mechanic might need a bit of a rework since it's hard to make it and balance it, you know. How about a clone wizard who does the exact same damage as the enemy he's fighting, instead of like every other wizard? Genuinely sounds like a pretty clever idea. Next up, an evolution idea which may blow your socks off. How about make the evolved mirror deploy a clone of the mirrored card in the direct opposite lane? Could you imagine that? Definitely scarier, and it sounds very OP. If that happened to me, I'd just close out of my game, move on with my life. And our last concept idea, we got another evolution idea, and this time on clone. What if you made the clone spell stay on the ground like other spells instead of being instant, and the troops that walk through it get duplicated? It definitely gives an interesting idea to the spell. I mean, why not? If that's possible, well, at least add the area damage to it then. As you could tell, Clone wasn't the best card, and neither was it very good. With other cards, sure, it made great combos, but alone, it was bad. One of the worst to ever be introduced. If not for the card combos, it may have ended up like the original heal spell, getting replaced by a spirit, which could be an interesting idea, or probably even getting deleted. Thankfully, that hasn't happened yet, and probably never will. Fingers crossed. But there is one card in Clash Royale that totally shattered the game when it first dropped. It was the most game-breaking, game-changing air troop ever introduced. So check out my next video where I dive into the insane history of the Phoenix. Can't wait to see you there.